Well, Doug Smith, welcome to Hope Between the Lines.
Honored to be here.
Dude, I am excited for this chat, and I need to tell the world what I appreciate about you. I have known you, we met, what, 17, 16 years ago,
Yeah. Wow.
through, yeah, it's been a minute,
I'm like,
right?
oh my gosh. So yeah, and I guess it has. Yeah, it's 2008-ish, I want to say. Yeah.
Yeah, and it was one of those cool moments where, cool connection, and then over time, just life led us two different ways. And as of late, we've been able to reconnect and kind of talk life with each other in a couple of great phone calls. But here's one thing I really appreciate about you. You are one of the most intentional people I personally know. I love your intentionality. I love the fact that you live with an understanding of the value of time in a way that is very healthy and also super encouraging, man.
We really appreciate that. And as you've always known this, I appreciate your voice. And I'm sure everyone listening to this, you have the sexiest, I think when I met you, I said you have the sexiest voice in youth ministry. Yeah. That may have expanded internationally. You
Oh
may
my
have the sexiest
gosh.
voice on the planet. But you've been such a great friend for many years. I think it was years, we had monthly phone calls
Yes.
where you were a constant source of encouragement. And, I hope I was the same to you. I know you went through some really challenging times as well. And it's just such a great joy. 15 years later, I know we're not at our finish line yet, but to still be going strong in ministry and making a difference for God and the kingdom is just awesome, man. It's been a joy to follow you and call you friend.
Well, yeah, and this is how life is. It's best lived with others. It's best achieved with others, and that's what I'm grateful about relationship and friendship. It is literally the vehicle for all great things in life. It is literally a ship that can carry anybody anywhere for some
Mhm.
really good things. And so I got to tell you about a pretty funny elementary childhood story of mine. I was telling my kids this story the other night, and they LOL'd. But I don't know if have you heard of like spit takes? Do you know what those are? They're
No,
like
no.
somebody is drinking and then something funny happens and then they spit out.
Oh, for sure.
Well,
Yeah.
yeah. So I think that's called a spit take. So in elementary school, chilling at the lunch table, got my friends to my right, to my left, and I'm trying to enjoy some 2% milk out of those cartons. And my friend next to me tells me a joke, but he says it right as I'm drinking. I completely showered the person across the
Oh
table from me.
man.
It was absolutely bad.
That's
Uh,
beautiful.
yeah, and now it is, but
Yeah,
I
not at the time.
no, they were not happy with any of that. But
Do you remember
uh,
the joke?
of course I don't, but I just know that it was good enough to create a spit take. And yeah, I don't know if you've had any moments that come to mind in your life where you're like, man, that was really interesting, or that, man, I'm glad that happened now, but maybe not then.
Yeah, man. The one that came to mind as I was thinking about this, I was dating my wife. So, listeners don't have a full context for my story, but my life was an absolute mess until I was 17, met who would be my wife. And, little did I know it would take me 10 years to grow into the man I needed to be to marry her. But I had gotten really close with her family. And there was a period of time where I felt like God dealt with my heart to break up with her for a period. Oh, I thought it was going to be forever. Obviously that didn't happen, but
Hmm.
I break up with her, and that was the beginning of what we call the dark years. Um, and I knew her family so well that I guess I'll share two brief funny things. One, I felt I knew her family so well that I had to take every member of her family out to explain myself. And
Okay.
all I was trying to do was basically say, I don't have a piece of my heart. I feel like God's leading me to lay this down for the time being. But I was not that articulate when I was a young man. And I met with her father, who would one day be my father-in-law. And
Yeah.
I said, when I'm around Laura and your family, I feel like your dog Carnegie tied to a tree, and I feel like I can't go anywhere in my life. But when I'm not with you guys, I feel like I'm free to run around the yard, and it's awesome. And clearly that didn't translate into I just don't have a peace about being in this. And so
Yeah.
he looked at me, and long story short, he got super ticked. He leaves the breakfast, and thank God, God dealt with his heart on the way there. to his house, hey, that's your future son-in-law. Keep
Wow.
investing in him, even though you probably want to kill him now.
Right.
So fast forward, I don't know, maybe 6 months, we had been in this habit of taking guy trips with his other son and my other brother-in-law. And so we go away, and the first night we were at a hotel. I'm usually the first one to get ready. I usually shower pretty quick. And so I'm in the hotel, I take a shower, they're out in the room waiting for me to be done. And I get out of the shower and I reach out for a towel, and man, there are no towels. And
Perfect.
and I thought, okay, like no big deal. There was kind of like two bathrooms. So I thought maybe the towels are just in the other room. And so I stand out butt naked, and I open the door and I look around for a towel. I don't see any towels, but I see a letter on the ground. And my father-in-law and brother-in-law, who weren't that at the time, had left me a note. And in so many words, it said, Doug, do you think that you could break up and break my daughter's heart and my sister's heart without suffering any repercussions? You're wrong. We've taken all of the luggage, everything that you could possibly use to keep warm, and you are all alone, and you're going to stay there butt naked, freezing and shivering by yourself for hours. We're going out to dinner. And so they went out to dinner, left me in the room all by myself. And I can't even tell you the rest of what they did to me that night, but it was absolute torture.
All
But
right.
it's just great. And now that I'm a father of daughters, I greatly look forward to being able to pass that on to the next generation. So,
Yeah, no doubt. Like you've married into good stock. I I think there's something special and really powerful when love gets tough. And I feel like that's a layer that's actually missing in our culture right now, in this point on the historical map called time. I I think it's beautiful when love acts, and this is going to sound pretty contradictory, but when love punishes, um,
yeah.
because what your father-in-law and brother-in-law were communicating is, oh no, she's worth way too much
Mm.
to be treated that way, and you will not do that again. That that's actually beautiful. And I think we might be better off if we had more leaders defending love in more consistent ways. So uh, I
Oh,
have go ahead.
first of all, oh, yes, I agree with you. Only you could take me shivering naked in a bathroom and turn it into like this deep poetic lesson. It's been probably 20 years since that happened, and I have not once thought of that as tough love or a loving thing to do. But you're right. And so I feel like I owe my father-in-law an apology and a thank you,
Uh,
rather than just bringing it up and saying, I can't believe you did that. Yeah.
well, now that I mean, both of us are fathers of, and if anyone were to mistreat my little girl, it doesn't take much for emotion to start rising within me,
Right.
because I know what my little girl deserves, and the sense of injustice should anyone mistreat her is real inside of me. And I know you appreciate that too as a dad,
100%.
and I think it's supposed to be that way. I really do.
So this is where my mind goes. Listeners don't know me. So I feel like because of your deep voice, you should put yourself out to hire to dads who want to intimidate boys who may mistreat or just need to intimidate their daughter's dates,
Yes.
etc. Like getting a phone call from you, like Liam Neeson style, and saying, I have a very particular set of skills. If you
Yes.
mess with so and so's daughter, I will find you.
Yep.
I would pay you for that
Okay.
service, just letting you know.
I love that idea. That's great. That's great. So when we were, doing monthly phone calls years ago, man, I was just loving the pace that you were living. And then over time, paths went different ways. And I know you have walked through some pretty tough stuff in your story. And I'd love to learn, like, how how has your story twisted and turned since we last connected regularly, and where did you find the hope to keep going through the dark moments?
Yeah, that's a great question. I was on a podcast the other day, and someone asked me, Doug, what's been the greatest source of growth in your life? And I think they wanted me to say, this book, this mentor, this leader, and all of those things clearly have been influential in my life. But when I
Mhm.
really reflected on it, and I hate to say this, but it's been suffering.
Right.
And it's been the trying things in my life, the hard seasons that I've gone through, the dark seasons that have helped me grow the most. And so when I think back about my journey, there's many things I could share to answer your question, but most recently in the fall of 2020, I went through the darkest time of my life. And
Mm.
just to kind of give leaders context, I had gone on vacation. This was in the middle of COVID, and had a really 2 weeks of an incredibly relaxing vacation. I thought I was in a good place because I'd been going pretty hard. And I came back, and the night I came back from vacation, I had learned that I had lost a cousin to COVID, and
Oh,
I wasn't
no.
really close to this woman, but for whatever reason, that threw me into a panic attack.
Oh,
Now,
no.
I had had seasons of panic attacks in my life, maybe just two other seasons that I had a month or two of severe anxiety.
Mhm.
And so initially, I just didn't think much of it. Then the next night, I had an anxiety attack, and the
Mm.
following night. And so all of a sudden, I entered into the season of panic, and I thought, okay, I think I can
Wow.
get through this. Maybe this will just be, a few weeks. What do I know to do? Going back to the other two experiences. Well, about a month into it, they weren't stopping. And
Mm.
about a month in, I don't know how to describe this other than saying, if you've ever had an anxiety attack, they're the most frightening things ever. You feel like you're going
Okay.
to die. Your
Yeah.
heart's beating out of your chest. Multiple times I went to call 911 because I thought I was dying. Well,
Mm.
that physical feeling on my heart moved from my chest to my mind, and my mind literally felt like someone was like squeezing my brain. I don't know how else to describe it.
Wow.
And it was incredibly terrifying. And I remember at work, I was leading a meeting one day, and because of that feeling, like I got to the end of the meeting and I just remember saying, like, I can't do this. I can't do this. Like, I can't even be present or lead. And I went home, and I couldn't even look at an email. And I realized there was something terribly wrong with me.
Mm.
And so I reached out to our executive director, my boss, and I told him what was going on. He said, you need to take, you know, an indefinite leave. And then I started getting even more anxious, thinking, oh my gosh, I can't even read an email right now. Am I ever going to be able to work again?
Mhm.
Am I, do I have, disability insurance? Can I take care of my family? All those thoughts started racing through my head, and I got, so freaked out. And so I committed to taking a week off. And again, this was so tormenting to me. And when you're desperate, you'll do anything for help. And so when I say I exhausted every measure I possibly could to get help, I did. And what I think would be helpful for your listeners just to share through that journey. What I learned was I started going to therapy for the first time. I'd never
Mhm.
gone to therapy before. For me, my excuse, frankly, would have been I have tons of community around me. I'm in multiple, mastermind groups that I've been doing life with men for years. I don't feel like I need that therapy, but
Mhm.
little did I know how much I needed it.
Yeah.
I started meeting with mentors. I started reaching out to friends and literally doing everything, reading every book that I could on burnout and what to do in the middle of that. And through that experience, I learned multiple things. But before I go into the lessons learned, I guess I'll rewind. So that was the fall of 2020. If I rewind 9 months prior to that, it was December of 2019. And
Mhm.
I don't have time to share my whole story, but I was a drug dealer in high school doing drugs, headed the wrong direction. Christ came into my life and turned it around, which was beautiful.
Wow.
And I had a younger sister who basically just kept going down the same path we were both going.
Mm.
And long story short, my sister ended up becoming a heroin addict. She was homeless, and I work at a rescue mission that serves the homeless. She was in our program multiple times, thankfully rededicated her life to Christ. But always just had this struggle. And unfortunately, in December of 2019, I got a call. It was
Wow.
11 o'clock at night. My dad called me, and he just said, Doug Sire's gone. She overdosed.
Wow.
And she had overdosed 32 times in her life, which is crazy. But you just, you always know the call could come, but you don't know what you'll do when you did. Well, for me, as my boss and mentors relayed to me, they said, Doug, your sister passed away. I basically drove to my dad's house, cried for 30 seconds. Literally, that's the only tears I shed.
Mm.
Rescued my dad. My dad was a mess, as you could imagine.
Mhm.
Helped him, slept on the couch for 3 days with him, planned the funeral, put together a message for the funeral, put together fundraising for my nephews. I have 2 nephews, and tried to raise as much money as I could for their future. And as my boss said, you basically then just went back to work.
Mm-hmm.
And as I started, and I didn't think anything of it, I felt fine. And for me, I always justified feeling fine by the fact that, hey, I knew my sister knew Christ. When I was even younger, I lost my mom, and that's actually how I rededicated my life to Christ, is I found out my mom had a relationship with him. And so I always had this piece of like, hey, I don't have to grieve like everyone else grieves because of Christ. Well,
Yeah.
little did I know that wasn't true. And
Right.
so I started getting help, and I realized that my therapist said, Doug, I don't think you've ever grieved the loss of your sister. And I'm going to go so far as to say, I don't think you ever grieved losing your mom or your
Wow.
mother-in-law or your grandparents. And he said, Doug, let me just tell you about grief. He said, you can't say goodbye to something that you never said hello to.
Wow.
And so that was game changer for me. He said, Doug, what I want you to do is I want you to go to the grave sites of everyone that you've lost in your life. And I want you to write them letters and just see what God does with that experience. And I honestly had never even gone to any of their grave sites because, again, it's like, hey, they're not there. It's just a stone in the ground, blah, blah, blah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I went there, and man, I lost it. I started
Yep.
journaling. I wrote letters to each of them. God met me in a really special way in that moment. And for the first time in my 35 years at the time, I grieved
Yeah.
and I breathed and I let it all out. And my pastor said, Doug, and I know I'm tying this all together, but man, this is just kind of the progression. My pastor said, Doug, when you were a teenager, your mom was sick. She had a rare nerve disease, and you watched your mom die slowly over the course of 7 or 8 years. And you medicated the pain of that through drugs and alcohol all
Mm-hmm.
throughout high school. And he goes, then you lost your mom and you became a believer and started following Christ, which is wonderful. But then you just simply went from medicating through drugs and alcohol to medicating through performance.
Yep.
And that hit me like a ton of bricks. And I realized, man, that is the train I was riding for the past 15 years.
Mm-hmm.
And trying to perform to deal with the pain that I had never dealt with ultimately led me to a place of burnout, which was
Yep.
another huge thing. So lesson one was there was ungrieved losses in my life that I wasn't aware of. I didn't know how to deal with, etc. And I think so many people listening to this, one of the most beneficial things my therapist had me do on ungrieved losses was he had me create a trauma assessment, and
Mm-hmm.
basically had me order my life from ages 0 to 5, 5 to 10, 10 to 15, and write out any traumatic experiences that I had in those timeframes. And it could be as simple as, hey, in second grade, so a girl called me fat or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And man, and you start adding these stories up to I lost my mom, I lost my sister. We all have experienced probably way more trauma and traumatic events than we ever imagined.
That's right.
And if we don't learn how to handle those properly and grieve that and heal from those, you may not, hit rock bottom today, but there is coming a time where if you don't deal with that, you're going to have to go through something similar to what I went through. And let me just tell you, like, I pray that no one ever has to experience, what I experienced in that season.
Right.
So number one is just deal with your stuff and go to a therapist, go to mentors, get
Mm-hmm.
poured into, do whatever exercises. The second area, when it came to the burnout issue, was I was super worried that I'd never be able to work again. You were encouraging me, hey, Doug, you're super intentional. You use your time. And I prided myself on all of those things.
Right.
And now I couldn't even read an email.
Wow.
And I said to my therapist, I'm like, am I ever going to be able to work again? Like, is my capacity gone?
Hmm.
He said something so crazy. I expected him to say like, oh, like, you'll figure it out. But he just said, Doug, what I've learned about capacity is usually when people are dealing with what you're dealing with, it's not a capacity issue. It's unrealistic expectations that you have of yourself internally that are causing you to have no capacity. And that's when it hit me. Like,
Yeah.
I was running so hard, not only to prove that I was something, but
Mm-hmm.
also on capacity. I had expectations that were so ridiculous.
Right.
Like in the area of leadership, I literally thought if I'm not John Maxwell and don't have his leadership influence, I'm not a leader. If financially, I'm not financially independent like Dave Ramsey, then I'm not financially independent. If I don't look like The Rock or Arnold Schwarzenegger physically, then that may sound like I'm joking, but like that was the standard. So
Right.
people could compliment me on any area. Oh, you're a great leader. No, I'm not. And the weight that put on myself, and then just in a practical day to day, I had
Mhm.
just becoming a director at our nonprofit. And man, I was making decisions for the first time that were significant. And I thought, man, if one of these decisions is wrong, the whole organization is going to go under and it's all my fault. And I was
Mhm.
waking up with cold sweats in the middle of the night. And man, God never intended us and our bodies to handle that amount of stress. And
Mhm.
so I really had to learn to let go of the unrealistic expectations in my life. And the other thing I'll say with that, I'll just share a few more things and then we can go to the next subject. But in the area of trying to prove myself through performance, um, I had to do this exercise where I found out like what is the core negative root belief that's driving that behavior.
Mhm.
And at the end of the day, when I did the assessment, it was the fact that I don't believe I'm enough.
Mhm.
And so my therapist had me do this whole exercise where he had me write down all the evidence that I had that I wasn't enough. And long story short, there wasn't much. And the things that were there were just things I needed to heal from.
Yeah.
And then he had me write all the evidence that I had that I was enough. And what I found out was, man, I have all the evidence in the world that I'm enough.
That's
And
right.
I remember calling my dad. This was life changing for me. Now, if you're familiar with the 5 love languages, I'm words of affirmation. So just tell me I'm
Mhm.
awesome and I
Yeah.
feel loved. uh,
Yeah, yeah.
so I always wanted my dad to tell me he was proud of me and he loved me. But and I didn't know this till I was older. He's acts of service and gifts. And so he would open the fridge and be like, Doug, look in the fridge and all this food I got for you. And I'm like, so what else? You're supposed to do that.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
looking back now, it's like that was him saying, Doug, I love you.
Right.
And I called him and I was actually scared that I was going to not be able to work again. And I said, Dad, I don't think I'm going to be the director of development at Light of Life anymore. Like, I don't know what I'm going to do. And I wasn't really even looking for advice. And he just said, Doug, let me just tell you something. He said, people come up to me all the time and they said, they say, you must be really proud of your son. Like he's doing all these great things. You must be so proud. And my dad said, I always tell him the same thing. Like, yeah, I'm proud of him, but I would be proud of him if he was cleaning toilets.
Mhm.
And he goes, Doug, I don't give a what your title is. Right.
Sure. Yeah.
And man, I cried like a baby
Absolutely.
because for the first time in my life, I am enough, not because of any other reason than just I am breathing and living and God created me and I have value. And to hear that affirmation from my dad was helpful. And then one last thing I'll just throw out is just I reached out to a bunch of friends and they all were gracious and spent time with me. They
Mhm.
took walks with me. They dropped everything they were doing, which I'm so grateful for. And they all said the same thing separately. I don't know that it was planned, but they all said, Doug, one observation we've had is you've been neglecting deep friendships for a long time.
Mhm.
And you know, for me, it's like I have quote unquote thousands of relationships and
Yep.
friendships.
Yep.
But my one mentor is like, Doug, who are the people that don't know you as Doug at Light of Life or at L3 or all this other stuff you're doing? Like, who knows you as just that punk kid Bubba who had a little bit of potential that
Yeah,
maybe could be
yeah.
developed one day. And they're like, that's who you need to spend time with. And
Right.
I haven't been perfect at that, but that was game changing. So that was one of the hardest times of my life. And I would say it took me 2 years, honestly, to get back. I ended up getting on medication through that, which
Mhm.
again, I'm not a doctor, but you know, I know a lot of people are opposed to medication. Medication was helpful for me. I can say that fortunately, like I have been able to get off of that and I
Mhm.
feel back to my normal self, but it was a 2 year process of
Yeah.
just saying, am I ever going to get out of the season? Is there ever going to be another side of this? And I really didn't know, but I kept my hope in that I'm going to do everything it takes on my side to get as much
Mhm.
help as I can. And I'm going to trust God that he'll get me to the other side.
Right.
And I would just end by saying, being on the other side now, you know, I talked about suffering, being a great teacher. I shared this message that I'm sharing with you, which is probably why I just talked for 10 minutes,
It's
uh,
great.
all the time. And I am shocked at how many people come up to me and say, Doug, I either feel like I'm on the verge of what you went through or I'm in the middle of it. And I need that hope. And
Mhm.
it's so funny. And it's a biblical promise that, you know, God comforts us in our trouble
Yep.
so that one day we'll be able to comfort those who are going through the same thing we are. And I've seen that
Yep.
come through, and I am a better person because of what I've gone through.
Wow.
I'm a better leader because I've gone through. I'm a better father, husband,
Mhm.
and hopefully friend. And so never want to go through that again, but extremely
Right.
grateful for the person that God formed on the other side.
Yeah, absolutely. There is a sense in every step that a person takes where every step can be a fork in the road. And I think there's something beautiful and powerful when a person discovers that they can choose to lean in to the adversity. They can choose to trust God, who is greater than the adversity, and they can embrace the reality like, hey, my circumstance doesn't define me. This doesn't measure my identity's value. My dignity is immutable because God said so. And when a person is able to look up and discover that God has always been ready to help them,
Mm,
and they don't have to try and fight this out on their own. And that's what I heard loud and clear as you just shared part of your incredible story. You had help
mm.
and you were okay receiving it.
Yeah.
That's beautiful and that's powerful, Doug.
Yeah. No, no, thank you for that insight. And again, if you're listening to this and you're in something similar to Dan's point, there's nothing wrong with asking for help. In fact,
Exactly.
the Bible, the enemy's greatest lie will be that you're the only one going through this. Everyone else is living in victory except for you.
Right.
If you bring this up, everyone's going to think you're weak or not a strong Christian, and nothing is farther from the truth. I think our culture has been taught an improper, view on suffering. And I think we're taught that we should never suffer. But the reality is suffering comes to all of us. It's what do you do when you're suffering?
That's right.
And, the beautiful thing about the body of Christ is God's surround us with people like you and great friends who can walk us through the journey when we're going through tough times. And hopefully
For
we can do the
sure.
same for them.
Yeah, that's incredibly well said. And here is a core conviction that I have been able to discover through, my own story is that there's always hope. I mean, there
Mm,
doesn't matter what is going on, doesn't matter what has happened. And the reason why there's always hope is because God is good and
yes.
he is so powerful. He is so connected to every single resource that exists in all of creation, and he will command it all for our good. And not
Yeah.
will he marshal resources to help you and I live and thrive and heal. He's also going to take every single thing that happens and to make it good for us. I don't know how he does it,
Yeah.
but the Bible says he does it in Romans 8:28. And that actual word, causes all things to work together. The variant there, the Greek word is synergeo, which is basically synergy. God creates synergy through the calamity. I don't know how, but that's what he does because he is good. Doug, I am inspired by your story. Holy smokes, man. As we land the plane on this incredible conversation, I do have to ask, who are you proud of today?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of people I'm proud of. I'm
Yeah.
proud of you. I'm proud of the impact that you're making.
Wow.
I'm just really proud. I think I've just been thinking about this thought. I think the more you grow in leadership and the more people you're able to help, the less you care about your success and the more you care about seeing others succeed. And so, I can name very specific people that no one would know in this podcast, but for me, it's just anyone who's willing to grow and develop into more than they were yesterday. Like that's who I'm proud of. We're all trying to get better every day. And then the other thing that came to mind when you said that, this is when I work out, I throw on YouTube motivational videos with like, The Rock or whoever talking. And Matthew
Good.
McConaughey's speech came up on one. And he said, people asked me who my hero was. And my hero is me in 10 years. And then, he said, hey, 10 years passed and people said, are you your hero yet? And he said, absolutely not. Man, my hero's still me 10 years away. And he just talked about that continual growth. And so from
Mhm.
that sense, I would just say I'm also learning to be proud of myself.
There you go.
And I know that may sound self-serving, but I think so many people deal with insecurity and so many people battle bad thoughts about themselves. I was insecure for so many years. And I feel like just in the last year or two, God's really brought me to a place of confidence for the first time in my life. And in saying things like that, it's like, man, I'm proud of the person who had to walk through everything with God. And again, that's the
Mhm.
key. It's like, it wasn't me doing anything. I did my part. God did his part,
That's
but
right.
I'm just proud of the man I've become. And I hope that I'll continue to be proud of who I become daily over the next few decades.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I could not agree more on your thought about being proud of ourselves because what's the opposite of being proud of ourselves? For most people, it's being ashamed of ourselves. And the
Mm,
enemy of our souls is a master at speaking the language of shame. And huge difference between guilt and shame. Guilt says, I did bad. Shame says, I am bad. And guess what? The spiritual enemy of our soul wants us to believe that we are rotten to the core. Guess what God says to us? In him, we are being made new. So
mm,
I think we can lean into the promises of God and trust him, but also affirm where we've come from, right? There's a book that I'm reading right
Yes.
now called The Gap and the Gain by Dan
Oh, come
Sullivan.
on. I was just gonna go there. Let's go.
And like it's incredible. And for those of you listening that aren't unfamiliar, the 30-second rundown is there's reality, which is the floor of the room, and then 3 feet up is how far you've come. But then there's your ideals, which is the ceiling of the room, right? And so the space between the floor and 3 feet up, what you've achieved is great. That's called the gain. That's real. But then the space between where you are and the ceiling, that's called the gap. And too many of us live in the gap. We meditate on the gap instead of celebrating the gain. And if we would just celebrate all that God has done,
Mm,
like where I was yesterday, thank God is not where I am today. And where I was 5 years ago, wow, that is like 4 states over, metaphorically
yeah.
speaking. God has brought me so far, and he's brought you so far. And that's the gain right there. And that's what every single listener can be proud of, is look at what God has done in me so far.
Well, and then just on that, probably 10 years ago now at this point, I didn't have the concept of the gap in the game, but I was living in the gap. And
Mm-hmm.
man, I remember one time I got depressed and man, I didn't even want to talk to my wife. And thankfully she's awesome and said, why don't you go spend time with God? And I
Yeah,
thought, of course, that's your advice.
sure.
But it was the right advice.
It's great advice.
And so, man, I shut myself in a room. I turned on worship music and man, I just felt led to read the book of Philippians. And I'm going to forget what verse it is, but in chapter 4, it basically just says, there's one key verse. I'm going to forget the rest of it, but it said, thank him for all he has done.
Mm-hmm.
And it was in the NLT version. And God dealt with me. He said, Doug, I want you to, in my heart, I want you to journal everything that I've done in your life from the time that you gave your life to me till now. And I was
Wow.
probably 28 at the time. And man, I just started journaling, going back to the gain. Man, I got a page into journaling and I was like 3 months into my walk with God. And man, I just started crying and I said, man,
Come
how can
on.
I ever not be grateful? How could I be living in depression and be ashamed of who I am and how far I've come when God has done so much for me? And I think
Yeah.
if people listening to this want something practical to take away from that, take some time to take an assessment and just write down everything that you've accomplished,
Yep.
how far you've come. And when you look at it actually on paper, you'll be shocked at how far you've come and what that'll do for your heart and spirit.
Mm-hmm. That's so good. Well said, my friend. And I can't thank you enough for joining me for this pretty incredible conversation. I know I've learned from you. My heart is full, just with inspiration, but also just practical steps that I can take as a man, as a husband, as a father, to just get healthier and to stay closer to God, but also to trust people more. Doug, thanks so much for making this conversation incredible.
Honored to be with you, my friend. Keep making a difference.